Have you ever been sitting in a room with your husband or your wife and you realize you have not looked them in the eyes in 3 days? Not because you are fighting, not because something big happened, just because somewhere along the way, without anyone deciding it, you both stopped looking. Saint Teresa of Avila saw what that does to a marriage, not as a metaphor, not as a feeling, as a spiritual reality that she documented with the same precision she used to describe mystical prayer, purgatory, and the interior rooms of the soul. And what she found was not just sad, it was dangerous in a way most couples never see coming until it is too late. Teresa of Avila was born on March 28, 1515, in the walled city of Avila in central Spain. She entered the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation at the age of 20 in 1535, and spent the next 20 years in what she herself described as a divided life, half drawn toward God, half pulled back toward the comfortable distractions of the world. The convent at the Incarnation had more than 180 nuns, constant visitors, social gatherings in the locutory, and a culture of conversation that left almost no space for silence. Teresa watched marriages from inside those walls. Brothers brought wives, fathers brought daughters, husbands came to confess, and she noticed something that nobody was talking about out loud. The couples who were suffering the most were not the ones who fought. They were the ones who had learned to coexist without ever really touching each other with their attention. She called it a slow withdrawal of the heart, and she was convinced it was not just an emotional problem, it was a problem of the soul. If you value documented spiritual history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work. And drop a comment telling us which city you are writing from right now. Also, this script draws from Teresa's own autobiography, known as the Libro de la Vida, written between 1562 and 1565, as well as from her masterwork, The Interior Castle, written in 1577 in just under 2 months at the urging of her confessor, Father Geronimo Gracian. These are not secondhand reports. These are Teresa's own words, examined by scholars like Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez in their critical translation published by the Institute of Carmelite Studies in Washington in 1976. Now back to the story. Teresa did not start with marriage theology. She started with a problem she saw in herself. In her autobiography, she writes about the years she spent at the Incarnation, giving and receiving what she called the conversations of friendship, where nuns would sit with visitors for hours in the locutory, talking about nothing important, and leaving each time feeling slightly more hollow than before. She says it was not that the conversations were evil, they were pleasant, they were warm. People laughed, people felt connected. But there was no real seeing happening. Everyone was present, but no one was looking. She writes that after those years, she came to understand that the greatest damage in any relationship is not caused by hatred. It is caused by a mutual agreement to remain in the shallows. She carried that observation into her understanding of marriage, and she was direct about it. Teresa believed that a husband and wife are given to each other as mirrors of the soul, not in a poetic sense, in a functional one. When you truly look at another person, when you hold their gaze long enough to actually see them and not just the image you have constructed of them in your head, something happens in you that nothing else can replicate. You are pulled out of yourself. Your ego softens for a moment. Your need to be right, your need to be comfortable, your ongoing internal monologue about everything you deserve and everything you're not getting, all of it quiets for a brief second. Teresa saw that as a form of grace, a cheap and daily form of grace that most married couples throw away without realizing what they are discarding. Now here is where Teresa gets specific, in a way that should make any married person stop and think. She wrote about what she called the third room of the soul, described in the Interior Castle, the first dwelling places of the third mansion. She says that the souls who live in this room are good people. They go to Mass. They do not commit grave sins. They are responsible, faithful in general, respected in their communities. But there is a subtle trap waiting for them. They have become so accustomed to their own spiritual routines, so comfortable with the shape of their inner life, that they have stopped being curious. They have stopped asking the deeper questions. And in marriage, Teresa saw this exact pattern play out in living rooms and bedrooms across Spain in the 1500s. The husband and wife who never look at each other anymore are not cruel people. They are comfortable people. They have found a rhythm. They know who does what. They have their roles. They talk about the children, about money, about what needs to be fixed and what needs to be bought. And underneath all of that practical choreography, two souls are slowly going dark, not because either of them chose it, but because comfort without attention becomes a kind of spiritual anesthesia. Teresa had a name for the moment when two people in a marriage begin to avoid eye contact without even knowing they are doing it. She called it the closing of the interior door, and she was unsparing about what it means. When you stop looking at the person you married, when you start moving through the same house like two parallel lines that never meet, you're not just losing intimacy, you are refusing the gift. Because in Teresa's theology, drawn directly from her reading of Augustine and later from John of the Cross, Every person you encounter is a point of access to God. Not symbolically. Actually, the face of a person who loves you and is loved by you is a place where the divine becomes visible in a way it cannot become visible anywhere else. She wrote in a letter to her brother Lorenzo in 1577, a letter preserved in the complete works edited by Kavanaugh and Rodriguez, that the most dangerous spiritual condition is not despair but indifference. Despair at least knows something is missing. Indifference has decided that nothing is, and she watched couples fall into that indifference not through betrayal, not through violence, not through the catastrophic events that tear families apart in obvious ways, but through the daily, undramatic, entirely voluntary act of looking away. What does that actually look like in a house? Teresa was precise. She was a practical woman who reformed 16 Carmelite monasteries across Spain between 1562 and 1582, the year she died. She did not deal in vague feelings, she dealt in behaviors, and the behavior she flagged most consistently in her writing about human relationships is the one we would today describe as performative presence. You are in the room, but you are not there. You answer when spoken to, but you do not initiate. You eat at the same table, but you read while you eat. You sleep in the same bed, but you turn away before the other person is asleep. And you tell yourself, none of this is a problem because nothing is technically wrong. There is no affair, there is no abuse, there is no crisis. There's just a silence that has slowly become the default language of the house. Teresa says, in The Interior Castle, first written in Toledo in June of 1577, that the soul which lives in the third mansion has acquired the habit of safety. It has learned to protect itself from the vulnerability of being seen, and this is exactly the mechanism behind the avoidance of eye contact in a marriage. Eye contact is exposure. Real eye contact, not the glance you give while passing in the kitchen, but the sustained, deliberate gaze that says, I am here and I am looking at you and I am willing to let you look back. That kind of eye contact costs something. It requires you to put down your defenses for a moment. It requires you to risk being seen as tired, as uncertain, as older, as needy, as imperfect. And over years of marriage, many people discover that this risk feels too large for a Tuesday evening when nothing particular is happening, so they stop. And once they stop, the habit of not looking becomes its own architecture. The house rearranges itself around the avoidance. The chairs in the living room point at the television instead of at each other. The phones come to the dinner table. The bedtime ritual becomes a scrolling ritual. And two people who once could not stop looking at each other are now sharing 3,000 square feet and averaging, according to a study conducted by the University of Chicago's Population Research Center published in 2009, less than 35 minutes a day of face-to-face conversation, of which approximately 12 minutes involves genuine emotional content. Teresa would not have been surprised by those numbers. She would have said the architecture of avoidance has always been with us. What changes is the tools we use to construct it. In her time, it was excessive visiting, long hours in the locutory, devotion to social reputation, obsessive management of household affairs. In our time, it is screens, but the movement is identical. Turn toward distraction. Turn away from the face of the person you promised to love. Here is what Teresa saw happen to the soul of a person who lives in a marriage like this for long enough. And this is the part that nobody warns you about. She wrote about it in chapter 19 of The Interior Castle, in the Third Mansions, when she describes what she calls the paralysis of the good soul. The person is not bad. The person is not lost. The person prays, works, provides, functions. But the interior life has calcified. It has stopped growing. And the reason it has stopped growing is that the person has cut off the primary human channel through which growth comes, which is the vulnerability of genuine encounter with another person. She uses the image of a castle with many rooms, each room representing a deeper level of the soul's movement toward God. And she says there are souls who reach the third mansion and simply stop. They will not go further. They have too much to lose. And what they are protecting more than anything is their carefully maintained sense of being fine. If I let my husband see that I am not fine, I am not fine. If I let my wife look into my eyes long enough to see that I am scared or lost or lonely inside this very life we built together, then that becomes real. So I look away. And Teresa says that the looking away is not just a social habit. It is a spiritual refusal. It is the soul saying no to its own next step. Now here's where it gets more complicated. Teresa was not writing about marriages where one person is distant and the other is desperate for connection. She was writing about the mutual agreement, the thing that happens when both people, separately and without discussion, have decided to accept the shallows. And the reason this is so much harder to address than a one-sided withdrawal is that it feels stable. It feels like peace. Nobody is suffering in an obvious way. Nobody is crying. Nobody is calling a lawyer. The house runs. The calendar is full. The Christmas cards look beautiful. And two people are dying slowly inside a life that looks, from every external angle, completely fine. St. John of the Cross Teresa's close collaborator and the man she helped enter the Carmelite reform in 1568 in Duruelo, a tiny village in the province of Avila, wrote about this same phenomenon in his Ascent of Mount Carmel, completed around 1579. He called it the night of the senses, the moment when all the comfortable, warm, emotionally satisfying aspects of a spiritual life, or in this context, a relational life, are stripped away, and what remains is either bare commitment or bare nothing. And he and Teresa both agreed that the soul cannot reach that night without first passing through the discomfort of genuine encounter. You cannot get to real love without going through the frightening moment of being truly seen. And the avoidance of eye contact is the daily, mundane, easily rationalized refusal of that passage. Let us stay with this a moment because it becomes practical. Teresa observed that the couples who maintained genuine presence with each other, who looked at each other, who asked real questions and stayed quiet long enough to receive real answers, who could sit in a room together without filling the silence with noise, these couples had something in their interior lives that the comfortable avoiders did not have. They had what she called a capacity for holy sorrow, the ability to be moved, to be affected by another person in a way that costs you something, to see the suffering of your spouse and let it land, rather than deflecting it into a problem to be managed. She wrote in a letter to Maria de San Jose in February of 1578, a letter now held in the archives of the Discalced Carmelite Monastery in Seville, that the soul which cannot be moved by the face of the beloved has already begun to die in a way that no one from the outside can see. And she was not using beloved in a romantic sense. She was using it in a theological sense. The person God has placed in your life as your closest companion, the one whose face should, above all other faces, be the one you know best and look at most. Here's the second thing Teresa documented, and this one lands harder. The avoidance of eye contact in marriage is not symmetrical in its effects. One person usually begins to withdraw first, even if both end up withdrawn. And the person who withdraws first usually does so not out of cruelty, but out of pain. Something happened. Maybe nothing dramatic. Maybe a comment that was never addressed. A need that was dismissed. An expectation that collapsed quietly. And rather than bring it forward, rather than say out loud, "I am hurting and I need you to look at me and hear me," the person learned to stop looking because looking had become too vulnerable. Teresa saw this in confessional. She was one of the most sought-after spiritual directors in 16th century Spain. By 1568, she had the attention of King Philip II's court, and by the time of her death in Alba de Tormes on October 4th, 1582, she had directed hundreds of souls, lay people included. And the pattern she described repeatedly was this: the withdrawal begins in one person as a protective response to pain, and the other person interprets it not as pain, but as rejection, and responds with their own withdrawal. And within 6 months to 3 years, the couple has constructed a full architecture of mutual avoidance and called it maturity, called it knowing each other, called it not needing to talk about everything, called it being comfortable. Teresa would have said, comfortable is not the same as connected, and the difference between the two is visible in whether you look at each other. If you're finding this valuable, subscribe and leave a comment with your city. This research is drawn from the critical edition of Teresa's complete works translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Attilio Rodriguez for the Institute of Carmelite Studies, Washington, first edition, 1976, and from Rowan Williams' 2003 study, Teresa of Avila, published by Continuum, which examines her relational theology with particular attention to her letters written during the Reform years. Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, argues that Teresa's most under-examined contribution is not her mysticism, but her practical psychology of human encounter. Now back to the story. What does it take to reverse it? Teresa was not abstract on this point. She prescribed what she called acts of deliberate attention, not romantic gestures, not anniversary dinners, not weekend retreats. She was talking about the simple, daily, tremendously difficult act of choosing to look, to stop what you're doing and turn your body toward your spouse, to ask a question that is not about logistics, to wait for the answer instead of formulating your response while they are still speaking. She wrote in The Way of Perfection, composed in 1566 for the nuns of San Jose in Avila, that love is not a feeling that arrives and departs on its own schedule. Love is a practice. It is something you do with your attention, with your body, with your eyes. And marriage is the school where this practice is either learned or abandoned. She had a specific observation about what happens in the body when two people resume genuine eye contact after a period of avoidance. She described it in terms that we would today recognize as the dissolution of the defensive self. The armor you have constructed around your sense of yourself in the marriage, the careful self-presentation, the management of perception, the quiet pride that maintains its dignity by never allowing itself to be seen as vulnerable, all of that begins to soften the moment real-looking resumes. And she said that softening is painful. It feels like loss. It feels like danger. It feels like the ground beneath you is less solid than you thought. And it is exactly the right feeling because it means something is alive again. The interior castle does not grow in safety. It grows in the passage between rooms that always feels like a threshold you're not sure you should cross. Now here is a specific account that connects all of this to something real and documented. In 1571, Teresa was appointed prioress of the Incarnation convent in Avila, the same convent she had entered 36 years earlier. This was not a comfortable appointment. The community was in financial crisis, the nuns were not observing proper enclosure, and the atmosphere was one of what Teresa called a habitual distraction from the interior life. She spent 3 years there, from 1571 to 1574, and during that time she brought in John of the Cross as confessor. What she observed in those 3 years among the 130 nuns who were living in essentially forced proximity without genuine encounter gave her the clearest picture she ever had of what happens to a community or household when the people in it have learned to be present without being present. She described it as a convent full of people who were technically faithful and genuinely lonely, and she said the loneliness was not about being alone. It was about being unseen, being in a room full of people who all knew your name and none of whom really looked at you. She made the connection to marriage explicitly in a letter written in 1573 to her friend and benefactress, Doña Luisa de la Cerda, whose husband had died in 1571. Teresa wrote to her not just about grief, but about the particular grief of realizing after someone is gone how rarely you had truly looked at them. She wrote, with characteristic bluntness, that the dead cannot look back, that the gift of the living face is one of the most neglected graces God gives to married people, and that the habit of looking away, accumulated across years of ordinary days, becomes one of the deepest regrets of the bereaved. Doña Luisa kept the letter. It is now preserved in the archives of the Medinaceli family in Madrid. It is 3 pages long. On the second page, Teresa writes something that functions almost like a warning to anyone who is not yet in the situation of grief, but could be. She writes that the eyes of the spouse are a kind of scripture, that God speaks through the face of the beloved more directly than through any amount of pious reading or formal prayer, and that the person who trains themselves to look away from that face has, without meaning to, closed one of the primary ways God reaches them. That is not a metaphor. For Teresa, who wrote in a Spain where theology was not separated from daily life the way it is today, that was a factual statement about the mechanics of grace. Grace comes through encounter. Encounter requires presence. Presence requires the willingness to look. The sociologist Sherry Turkle at MIT published research in 2015 in her book, Reclaiming Conversation, drawing on 4 decades of studying human communication, showing that the average American couple by the 10th year of marriage maintains eye contact during conversation for fewer than 4 seconds per exchange. 4 seconds. In the early months of a relationship, the same couples averaged between 8 and 12 seconds per exchange. Turkle traces the decline not just to screens, but to a broader cultural shift toward what she calls the habit of the half-present. The body in the room, the mind elsewhere. Teresa described this in 1566. She just did not have sociologists to confirm it. Here is the deeper current running under all of this. Teresa believed, and documented in the interior castle, across 7 sets of dwelling places, that the human soul is structured for encounter. It does not mature in isolation. It does not grow through the accumulation of private virtues practiced in a corner of your own mind. It grows through the friction and grace of genuine contact with another person, a contact that is most concentrated and most available in the relationship of marriage. Because marriage is the relationship where you cannot edit yourself completely, where sooner or later the face reveals what the words are managing, where real looking, if you allow it, will always show you something true. The couples who go through decades looking away from each other are not just losing warmth or affection or the feeling of being in love. They are losing the specific form of self-knowledge that only comes from being seen by someone who knows you well and loves you anyway. They are losing the mirror. And without the mirror, the soul turns inward, becomes increasingly self-referential, increasingly fragile, increasingly defended. Teresa calls this the soul that has made itself its own prisoner. Not through vice, through the reasonable, sensible daily decision to protect itself from the exposure of genuine encounter. The restoration she prescribed was not dramatic. It never involved a single transforming conversation or a romantic gesture that changed everything. It involved the decision, made consistently and repeatedly and often in the face of considerable resistance from the defended self, to look, to set down the book, the phone, the task, the perfectly good reason to be occupied, and turn toward the face of the person you married and actually look at them. Not to say anything necessarily, not to solve anything, just to look and allow yourself to be looked at. She wrote in the final pages of the interior castle, in the 7th dwelling places where the soul has reached the fullest union available to it in this life, that the mark of a soul that has truly arrived is not extraordinary mystical experience. It is the capacity for ordinary presence, the ability to be in a room with another person and give them the full weight of your attention, without needing the moment to be significant. The most advanced spiritual state Teresa could describe ended up looking like sitting across from someone you love and letting them see your face. She died on October 4th, 1582, in the small town of Alba de Tormes in the province of Salamanca, during a journey that was longer and harder than her health could bear. She was 67 years old. The last words recorded by Sister Ana de San Bartolome, who held her in her arms at the end, were, "At last, Lord, I am a daughter of the Church." But before she lost the ability to speak entirely, she had spent her final days asking the sisters around her to look at her, not to cry, not to pray loudly, just to look, to be present with their eyes in the way she had spent her whole life teaching and practicing. The nuns of Alba de Tormes confirmed in depositions taken during the beatification process in 1614 that in her final hours, Teresa's face was described as bright, extraordinarily calm, and, in the words of Sister Maria de San Francisco, as if she could see something the rest of us could not. She was looking toward the window, and she did not look away. The archive at Alba de Tormes holds the original deposition, 112 pages, recorded in the spring of 1614. On page 47, Sister Ana writes that when Teresa finally stopped looking toward the window, she turned her face to the sisters one by one and held each gaze for a moment before moving to the next. It took her less than 3 minutes to look at all 12 of them, and not one of the 12 who testified described feeling unseen. That is what she spent 67 years teaching, that the look you give is not a small thing, that the look you withhold is not a small thing either, and that the room where a husband and wife sit in the same light, facing the same walls, and cannot bring themselves to meet each other's eyes is not a peaceful room. It is a room where something that should be alive has gone very quiet. And the quiet, Teresa knew, is not the same as peace. It just sounds like it until you look closely enough. But let us go further into what Teresa actually diagnosed, because there's a second layer here that most people miss entirely. The avoidance of eye contact in marriage is not just about the two people in the room. Teresa observed that it radiates outward. It changes the household. It changes the children in the household. It changes the quality of everything that happens inside those walls, down to how food tastes and how rest feels, and whether the house at the end of a long day is a place you want to return to or a place you return to only because you have nowhere else to go. She grounded this observation in something she had seen firsthand in the households of the Spanish nobility that supported her reform. Teresa spent years moving between the homes of Doña Luisa de la Cerda in Toledo, Doña Maria de Mendoza in Valladolid, and other wealthy patrons whose houses were full of servants and order and surface respectability. And she wrote in her autobiography about the difference between the houses where the couple was genuinely present with each other and the houses where they had learned to coexist. She says, and these are her words paraphrased from Chapter 7 of the Life, that you can feel it the moment you walk through the door. A house where the husband and wife have closed the interior door between them has a particular quality of air. Everything functions. Nothing breathes. She connects this directly to a passage in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us. Teresa interprets this incarnationally, meaning that the presence of God is not abstract. It enters the world through bodies, through faces, through the sustained and deliberate contact of one soul with another. And in marriage, that contact is made available more abundantly and more consistently than in almost any other human arrangement, precisely because marriage is the relationship of maximum proximity. You cannot stay at a polite distance from someone who sleeps in your bed and eats at your table and sees you at your worst before the coffee is made. Maximum proximity is either maximum grace or maximum wound. Teresa saw both, and she was clear that the determining factor is whether you choose to look or choose to look away. She also wrote about what she called the temptation of the parallel life. This is the marriage version of what she described in The Interior Castle as the soul that creates a comfortable substitute for the real journey. In a marriage, the parallel life looks like this. Two people who are technically still together, but who have, over years, developed entirely separate interior lives, different friendships, different interests, different rhythms, different ways of processing experience. And they have stopped sharing those interior lives with each other, not because they decided to stop, but because every time they tried, something in the exchange felt clumsy or insufficient or too exposing. So they retreated to the parallel track. And the parallel tracks run in the same direction, toward the same destination eventually, but they never touch. Teresa says the tragedy of the parallel life is not that it is unhappy. Often, it is not unhappy. The tragedy is that it is unnecessary. The separation was not inevitable. It was chosen, one small avoidance at a time, one deflected glance at a time, one topic change before it could get real, one moment of vulnerability swallowed because the room did not feel safe enough or the timing did not feel right. And by the time the couple understands what has happened, the tracks are so far apart that neither person remembers how they got there. In 1562, The same year, Teresa founded her first Reformed Carmelite house at San Jose in Avila with just 4 novices and a budget that a biographer would later describe as less than what most Spanish merchants spent on shoes in a month. She received a letter from a woman whose name is not preserved, but whose situation Teresa describes in a letter to her confessor, Father Garcia de Toledo. The woman's husband had been a respected official in the regional administration. They had been married for 22 years. They had 4 children. And the woman wrote to Teresa because she had realized, on an ordinary afternoon while her husband was reading and she was sewing and the children were outside, that she did not know what her husband was thinking about. Not in the way you do not know because you have not asked. In the way you do not know because you have stopped being curious. And she wrote that the realization terrified her more than any crisis they had ever faced together. Because a crisis could be addressed. This could not be addressed. It had no name. There was nothing wrong and everything wrong, and she did not know how to say that. Teresa wrote back with characteristic directness. She told the woman to look at her husband. Physically, literally, to set down the sewing and turn her chair and look at his face. Not to say anything, not to explain herself, just to look. And to keep looking until he felt it and looked back. She said that the first real exchange of eyes after a long avoidance will feel like standing at the edge of a cliff. She said, "Stand there anyway." The letter is not preserved directly, but its contents are referenced in Teresa's own correspondence from that period, preserved in the manuscript collection at the Royal Academy of History in Madrid, where 14 of Teresa's original autograph letters are held among documents catalogued in the late 19th century by the historian Fidel Fita. There's a psychological architecture to eye avoidance in marriage that Teresa mapped with extraordinary precision without ever using the language of psychology. Contemporary research from the Gottman Institute in Seattle, founded by John Gottman, whose 40-year longitudinal study of married couples produced the foundational data of modern marriage research, shows that couples who maintain higher rates of face-to-face engagement and direct eye contact during neutral activities, not just during conflict or during romantic moments, show significantly lower rates of marital dissolution across a 20-year period. The specific figure from Gottman's 2012 publication, The Science of Trust, based on data collected from his Love Lab research from 1986 onward, is that couples in the highest quartile of sustained mutual gaze during ordinary conversation have a 43% lower probability of divorce at the 15-year mark than couples in the lowest quartile. 43% from looking at each other. Teresa would have found that number unsurprising. She would have said that anyone who understood what the eyes actually do in a relationship would have predicted it. The eyes are the organ of encounter. They are the place where the interior life becomes visible to another person, whether you want it to or not. You can control your words, you can manage your tone, you can choose which stories you tell about yourself and which you keep. But your eyes, held long enough by someone who knows you, will show what is actually happening inside. And this is exactly why people stop looking. Not because they have run out of things to show, but because they are afraid of what will be seen. Teresa's prescription, repeated across the interior castle, The Way of Perfection, her autobiography and her letters, is the same in its essence every time. You cannot become who you were made to be while protecting yourself from being seen. The growth of the soul requires exposure. And in marriage, the primary form of that exposure is the face. She describes in the 5th Dwelling Places of the interior castle what she calls the silkworm stage of the soul, the moment when the soul has consumed enough spiritual nourishment to begin the transformation from one state to another. And she says that the silkworm must die to itself in order to become something new. The old form cannot hold the new life. And in marriage, she applies this image to the moment when a couple must choose between the comfortable safety of parallel coexistence and the discomfort of real encounter. One of those paths leads somewhere. The other leads to a beautiful and hollow stillness. The couples who choose encounter do not have easier marriages. They have harder ones in many ways, because real looking generates real conversations, and real conversations generate real conflict, and real conflict generates real growth. Teresa was not offering a path to comfort. She was offering a path to life. The couples who choose the parallel track have, for a long time, what looks like the better arrangement. Less friction, more predictability, a kind of peace that photographs well and functions smoothly, until one of them gets sick or loses a job or faces a terror that cannot be managed alone. And at that moment, the parallel tracks reveal what they are. 2 people who have been sharing a roof but not a life. 2 souls in the same house with no way to reach each other because they have not practiced reaching in so long they have forgotten it is possible. Teresa wrote about this specifically in the context of death. She had seen it enough times among her patrons and their families to document it with precision. The spouse who is left behind after decades of a parallel marriage faces a grief that is double in its weight. There is the ordinary grief of losing someone you have lived alongside. And there is the deeper, quieter, harder grief of losing someone you never really knew. Someone who was right there, reachable, for 20 or 30 or 40 years, and now is not there and never will be, and you cannot go back and look at them the way you did not look at them while you had the chance. Teresa called that second grief the sorrow of the unlived encounter. One of the most preventable sorrows she knew. It required nothing extraordinary to prevent, only that you turn toward the face of your husband or your wife on an ordinary Tuesday and let them see you. In the excavations conducted in the late 1980s at the Monastery of the Incarnation in Avila, archaeologists from the University of Salamanca, working under a grant from the Spanish Ministry of Culture, uncovered, beneath the original locutory floor, a set of carved wooden panels that dated to the early decades of the 1500s, Teresa's own era. The panels depicted faces in pairs, always turned toward each other. The style was simple, almost crude, but the repeated motif was unmistakable. Every face carved on those panels was looking directly at the face across from it, not at the viewer, not at the sky, at the other face. The archaeologists noted the find in their 1991 report published by the University of Salamanca Press and described it as decorative, probable religious symbolism of unknown significance. They may have underestimated the significance, because in Teresa's spiritual world, the face turned toward the face it loves is not just a symbol. It is the whole story. It is what the 7 dwelling places of the interior castle are moving toward. Not a private union with an invisible God achieved in a room with the door shut, but the soul expanded by encounter, shaped by being seen and by seeing, opened by the vulnerability of real presence into something large enough to hold not just one life, but 2. The couples who stop looking at each other in their living rooms are not failing at romance. They are failing at something older and more serious than romance. They are refusing the particular form of grace that only comes through the face of the person who shares your life. Teresa knew that, and she spent 67 years saying it. She said it in formal theology. She said it in letters to grieving widows. She said it in the carved wooden panels of a convent locutory in Avila that nobody paid much attention to for 400 years. She said it at the end of her life with her own face, turning in its final hours to look one last time at every person in the room. She did not look away.